The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Could it be that some issues are so complex that the best way to talk about them is through a fictional world? I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Tonight, we'll explore that with writer Jael Richardson. There are many reasons to talk to Jael Richardson. She's a writer, a radio host, and founder and executive director of the Festival of Literary Diversity. And now her debut novel is out, and it's on many must-read lists. It's called Gutter Child and is as topical as it is terrific. With us now for more from Brampton, Ontario, Jael Richardson. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
This is such a... It's such a wonderful book. It's also gut-wrenching. Within the first few pages, you actually give a warning to the reader to take their time with the book. What inspired you to create the world of Gutter Child?
Yeah, so I wrote a book about my dad, Chuck Ely, who was a memoir about his life and my experiences growing up Black in Canada compared to his growing up Black in America. And when I was done researching the memoir, I had all these questions about sort of the oppression that he faced, about the civil rights movement. And I started to wonder what it would look like to grow up in a world that was designed for your failure. And I sort of started looking at my dad's life that way. But I wanted to look at it from a female perspective. I wanted to consider different things. And I ended up creating this dystopia so that I could explore those things about race, about colonization, about systems, without kind of the rules of reality that I had been so glued to in a memoir. And talking nonfiction, you're sort of stuck in what's true, what's factual, what you know. And a dystopia allowed me to explore some of these questions about race, about politics, about identity, while making my own rules for the world, by creating my own characters, and by allowing them to navigate situations that were unexpected.
Now, in this society, in this world, it's divided between the mainlanders and the gutter people, and eventually we are introduced to the people on the hill. How would you describe those different societies?
Yeah, so the three different spaces are sort of the critical dystopian world, right? So a dystopia is when you invent a world and then you create your own rules for it. And so there's the gutter, there's the mainland, and the hill. And the mainland used to be Soci territory and was taken over by a group of people who called themselves mainlanders and named the land mainland. And the gutter is where most of the Soci people were sent, and they were given a debt. And the debts passed down generation after generation. And that's one of the difficulties of the world. They're also scarred at birth. And so that becomes something in the story as well. And then there's the hill. And you learn all this in the early pages, so don't worry if you haven't read it. But the hill is this other place where some Soci people went to early on. And so there's differences between Soci people who've raised in the gutter, Soci people who've been raised on the hill, and now also as the story begins with Soci people who are at academies on the mainland.
It's interesting because I think the dynamics between the Soci people and the people who are part of the gutter system, you would think that they would be on the same side. And I wonder if, even now we're going into so many elections, a lot of things are happening around the world, and this idea that people of color, Black people, are a monolith. Was that intentional on your part to kind of create that additional world to show the dynamics between the Soci people and the gutter people?
Yeah, I think it's really important to show, for me, what I was interested in when I'm looking at systems and worlds that are designed for your failure. There's also different ways of navigating, different choices that are made along the way. And that's one of the challenges of dealing with a political issue like racism. There are different people who navigate those choices in different ways. So some people will say, let's change the system, let's fight the system, let's tear down the system. And other people will say, let's just work within the system. Let's just follow the rules that have been laid out and overcome them that way. And I think it's really important to understand that when we fight issues like racism, there are not easy solutions, or we would be moving through solutions much more quickly. The issue is that even within a single community, the Black community, the disabled community, the queer community, there are differences in how we navigate those. And I really wanted to examine that. I wanted even there's sort of 5 key characters that you learn about in the early stages that are important throughout the book, in addition to Amina, who's sort of the central character. I wanted to see what choices Amina would make, what different choices the other characters would make as a result of where they lived and where they went. And I wanted to think through some of the things I was struggling with. You know, what's my role when I'm facing systems of oppression, having grown up Black, but also with privilege? And how does that differ from someone who's grown up with very little? And what do I need to learn from them in the process?
And also the stories that we tell ourselves and we tell each other. As you mentioned, Amina, the book is based around Amina. How is this story the history that she is taught about her people different from the reality?
Yeah, I mean, it was really fun to write. One of the great things about a dystopia is talking about the backstory and sort of how you got here, how you get to this world and this moment. And it was a really interesting personal struggle for me.
In what way?
I realized in writing this book that I had grown up only learning history from slavery and emancipation on. I sort of believed, my parents are American, and I sort of carried the fact that we were slaves, we overcome slavery, and that's sort of the story I've literally told and understood about my life and about my ancestry, because I don't know where we were before that. But the reality is that I'm a descendant of kings and queens. I'm a descendant of royalty. I'm a descendant of people who ruled their land and built communities that were good and strong. And we were stolen from that. And then slavery happened. And then emancipation happened. And that little bit of our history, that emancipation and slavery, that's such a small part of who we are. But the difficulty for me is I have no way of connecting my life to the country that my ancestors are from and the actual land that they're from. So writing Amina's backstory was a couple of things for me. It was about giving her a story that reminds her that she is the original people of a land, that she has value, that things were taken from her and stolen from her, and her story is about what she's going to do in response to that. And there were a lot of parallels for me and a lot of sort of corrections that I wanted to build into the story for Amina that I have seen happen in my life, understanding where I'm actually from, who I'm actually what communities I'm actually a part of, and what's been misrepresented in the history books that I've read in school, in the stories that we tell, on Black History Month or throughout the year.
That's interesting that you say that, because currently right now there's this huge discussion about critical race theory. I think a lot of us don't know what it means. I've always gotten the sense from a very young age that it was important to learn history, to know history so we can learn from history. But now we're in a space and time where people are deciding, well, maybe there's parts of the history that we don't need to learn. What does it do, even for the characters in the book, what does it do for them to understand the history instead of the history that they've been taught?
Yeah, I think it's critical. I think one of the ways we sort of tie people down is by limiting what they know about themselves. Growing up, I never read a book by a Black writer. I didn't read a book by a Black writer until I went to university. And it was an epic moment. Like when I read it, something snapped open in me and I realized I wasn't alone. My stories had value. And it was like in that moment, light bulbs off, like all the cliches, that's what happened. And I realized I was able to have that opportunity because I went away to university, but that was an expensive experience, right? Those are things that we should all get as a part of public education because they change how we feel about ourselves and how we look at the world. Throughout high school, I thought that I was losing my mind because I would get so frustrated, angry by the representations I saw on TV, by the racist comments my friends and not so friends would make. I would get so angry and I would keep it bottled up inside. And I think when we feel like we don't belong, like we don't have a story or a place or an opportunity to share our voice, we do damage to ourselves. We carry these things inside of us, and writing stories, writing books, reading stories, reading books, those things change our ability to confront the problems that exist. And it allows us to begin the work of breaking down systems that we're trained to believe don't exist, right? We're trained to believe that our history is slaves were free in Canada, Indigenous people didn't have it so bad. These are all the things people want us to believe, the system wants us to believe. But the truth is, Black people were slaves in Canada, Indigenous people had their land stolen from them, and we have to confront the truth of those things if we're ever going to do better in the future.
You mentioned the systems, but words like colonialism, apartheid don't appear in the text, but they're clearly the subtext. Why did you choose to write about it without naming it?
Yeah, so I call characters gutter characters, mainlanders, soci people. I call different people different things, but I never refer to them as Black. I never call or white. I never call things colonization or apartheid, even though there are whispers of that throughout the book. And it's because I really wanted to explore the issue without those names and those things that some people know about them and some people don't. I really wanted a reader to come in and kind of have a free landscape to explore these topics and think about the characters. And I've done a few book clubs with students, and what's great is that students have the ability to discuss and engage from their own perspectives. Some people, a student from South America was like, I see evidence of this in my own family, in my own community. And students have been able to talk about it from the places that they're from without carrying the baggage or the pressure of whatever the community they're a part of or trying to address. And I've seen when people talk about it as like, these characters are Black and these characters are white, it changes the dynamic of who feels comfortable talking about it. But when you talk about the characters as being gutter or soci or mainlanders, it allows a freedom to discuss things in a new way. And that's, I think, what makes books so great, what I love about dystopia.
For those from the gutter, there are trade-offs that need to be made in order to survive. We've talked a little bit about that. One of these trade-offs is maybe not having children because of the debt that they would incur. You write, mainlanders build things in such a way that giving a baby up is the best option you've got. Does one's survival become a burden when you are in the gutter system?
Yeah, I think that's the question, right? I wanted the gutter to feel like this really difficult place on one hand, but also this very normal community on another hand. And I think, a lot of people make connections to some of the things we see happening or have happened in the past. But one of the things that I really wanted to point to in this idea of sending your children away, of giving them a better opportunity, right? That's something we talk about a lot. And we see, especially I know a number of my friends and families who are Caribbean, who are sending their children to Canada, who are going to Canada and leaving their children behind in order to get this better life. And I think we really have to think about what kind of systems that creates, what kinds of family dynamics and difficulties that creates. And we really want to correct that. We really want to create systems where everybody has access to good education, where they can keep their family with them, where they can stay together. And that becomes a really important theme in the book, because for me, understanding the importance of community has been key. Understanding how systems are designed to kind of keep communities apart, to break us apart, means that we have to work really hard to find community, to build it, to hold it tight, to keep it close, to protect it.
In what ways is language used to minimize the harm that is caused and to shape the stories that are told about the gutter system?
I think language becomes key, right? For me, language and storytelling is the way in which we begin to correct the wrongs we see around us. And one of the reasons the main character is 14 at the start is because I think that's a really critical age where language and ideas are forming. And one of the things that happens very early on in the book is this gathering around a book of poetry and reading poetry that allows young people to hear what they're struggling with and maybe can't put into words. And it's what I love about, high school English classes and all this, because it's an opportunity to use something fun, to use entertainment, poetry, books, to challenge what we see in the world, to challenge what we're thinking about. And so for me, language is key to tearing down systems of oppression, understanding the words that are used and how they're used, For example, even using the word gutter, I wanted something that was automatically negative, but was also given to them, because it's also why we are called Black people to this day, right? Because it was the name that was assigned to us. There are negative connotations that we've had to sort of transform into positive affirmations. But we have to think about the way that language of Blackness and whiteness impacts every day. I used to go to church all the time, and all of the songs were about like wash me whiter than snow and black is sin and evil and bad. And there was actual challenges for me taking on that word and saying I'm Black and being proud of it, because I still felt and heard that sort of evil sin kind of language in my head. And so we have to look at language, and the characters have to look at language to unpack how they're going to navigate this world and when they're going to speak up, if at all.
One thing that I did find really jarring in the book are the markings. The X's on the hands, because you said you didn't want to say this is a Black experience, this is an Indigenous experience, but the markings clearly other the people who are in the gutter system. Was that intentional?
Yeah, so the two things that gutter kids, gutter people experience in the story are the debt and the scars. And for me, it was about examining two things and allowing some of the characters to deal with it in different ways. It was about examining the pressure that we carry inside of us, that sort of debt that maybe people can't see how big our problems are or small they are, but we're still carrying this debt. And the scars were about the physical evidence of oppression, that sort of symbol, much like the color of our skin, that says this is someone who's different. This is someone who doesn't belong. This is someone who is a threat. And I really wanted to examine how the characters felt about that, who were scarred, how it was different for some of the characters who do not have scars, and how, in particular, it's different for Amina, who only has one scar.
You did mention that you were on the show about 5 years ago, and we spoke to both you and your father, Chuck Ely, the former CFL great, and we talked about the Black experience. We have a clip from that. Sheldon, please roll.
Yeah, Blackness was a really confusing thing for me growing up. I think when I started to realize that I was Black and I started to wrestle with what that meant, it mainly had to do with the fact that I didn't feel like I belonged anywhere, like I was a person without a home, because to be Canadian to me meant to be white. And you saw it on TV, you saw it reinforced, and I remember the I Am Canadian commercial where Joe stands up and lists all the things that make you Canadian, and some of the things I didn't even understand, but I saw this young white man and I said, that's Canadian, he's wearing plaid, he's Canadian. And I couldn't figure out what that meant to me.
You mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, first of all, look how young we were.
I know, right? Oh my God.
Personally, for me, the pandemic has aged me. But, at the beginning of the conversation, you mentioned that when you were here in that conversation, the way that you grew up informed how you wrote Amina. Reading the book, some people might think that when you say that you don't feel like you belong, people might think that that's a little bit trivial. It's like, well, you're Canadian, just get over it. Color doesn't matter, all those kind of things. But even from your father, there's, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I sensed a bit of grief in that clip from you. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I regret the lack of understanding I had when I was younger, right? I feel sad about the way I didn't really know or want to be Black. And I don't think, my parents are only children. So we didn't have any aunts or uncles, and we didn't have any cousins growing up. And so it was really just our family. And I would say my siblings would probably agree that we all kind of struggled or wrestled with this on some level. And I think for me, when I realized what I was missing was when I met my husband, and his family is the opposite. 9 siblings on one side, 13 on the other. And he has, so many aunts and uncles and cousins. And I realized that from the time he was born, he had a community, a Black community around him to kind of enforce and inform these kinds of ideas about himself, and to not just one way of being Black, but multiple ways of being Black all the time, so that he himself could figure out his own way. And being around them has allowed me to see that. And I think in the book, in Gutter Child, that's kind of what Amina is working through as well. She's been removed from her community. She's been removed from people who look like her. And she's been told things that are not true, told not to look in certain directions, so she can't figure out what's going on in the world. And when she's reintroduced to her community, there's this sense of like, I don't know what to do here. I don't know who I am. But the beauty, I think, I hope, in the book is that that's what the journey is, for her to figure that out, for her to unpack that. And it's so interesting listening to that clip, because it really is where the book started for me. That conversation, and I think very literally, it's taken me 8 years to write Gutter Child. I think that conversation I had already started like the very beginning stages of the book.
Well, I'm glad that you brought that up, because I was kind of curious in the research that you did behind this. How much research did you do for this book to write it?
Well, I mean, I think I kind of cheated. I think I used a lot of the research that I had done for my dad, the book about my dad, and for the Stone Thrower, and I think there was just so many things that I could not reconcile. There's a story about an athlete in the book. I won't spoil it too much, but all I'll say is, one of the things I looked at in my dad's life was the choices he made, but then also the choices that other Black athletes in the 60s were making, and some of the fallouts of those decisions and choices. And that was I really wanted to sit in that. And so one of the characters is really based on those stories about athletes who were put in these very premium attention-getting positions, and then also really struggled under the pressure of being celebrated and then facing racism all around them.
Have you spoken to your dad about reconciling that past and not having to come to a different country and creating a whole community, a whole life? Does he mourn what he lost in the States?
No. I feel like he doesn't mourn what he lost in the States, I don't think. I think he's very grateful for Canada and what Canada has given him. And I think that honestly is part of the problem for me, is because Canada provided something new for him and gave him something that he didn't have or didn't feel in the States as an athlete. But for me, I don't know. I haven't lived in the States, so I'm not saying it would be better or worse. But I'm just saying the experience I've had here has had lots of questions. And it's not something my mom or my dad can really understand fully in the same way, based on where they lived and based on, differences in gender and all these kinds of things. The experience I've had here is unique, and it's not unique to Black folks in Canada, but it's different from the one my parents experienced. And I think first generation Canadians can generally kind of agree that there's unique challenges to being born and raised here. There's a pressure to be grateful, and I am, but there's also a need to also criticize, to look with a critical lens, like you were talking about critical race theory. It's important to look critically at where we are, at the problems of this place that we're in, and to work towards solutions.
It's one thing to launch a book in normal times, especially your first novel, but you've had to do it against the background of a pandemic and following the murder of George Floyd last year and the global Black Lives Matter protests that followed. There was a lot of talk about a reckoning over race. What has the last year been like for you in that context?
It was bad. It was really bad. I was finishing the book around the time of the Ahmaud Arbery shooting, and then Breonna Taylor, and there was Central Park Karen, and then George Floyd. So for me, George Floyd was like the peak of a hill, of a climb that we were on that just got worse and worse and worse. And I was trying to wrap up the book, and I will say the ending actually changed because of what was going on in the world and because of the state that I was in. And that note you read that I put at the beginning about, these are difficult times, take care while you're reading this, was because at the time I was like, I should be giving people a comedy or a romance novel right now. Like, that's what people need. This is like really tough. But this was the book I had. This was the book that I had been working on for 8 years. And so I just had to give it to the world with a bit of warning. For me, actually, it's not a sad book or a tragic book. It's just a complicated life story that some people are living in various ways to this day. So I think that was tough, just knowing what I was going through and then knowing I was giving a book that does explore some heavy topics. But I also think it's been nice to just be at home, to be with family. I haven't been traveling, obviously, very much. And so it's been probably better on my body and mind physically to be able to just walk out of my bedroom, do a conversation and go back, as opposed to the added labor of traveling, driving, flying, whatever it is. And so I have to say, it's not what I would choose. I would love to do an in-person event and just see like one human who had read the book, even like only one person had to show up.
You know, I was on the train and someone stopped me and said, my friend wrote that book, can I take a picture? I thought that was really lovely because there's a lot of people that are supporting, and the book has really resonated with a lot of people. You know, when I mentioned the Black Lives Matter protest, a lot of different industries were forced to look at themselves and their shortcomings, including the space that I work in, media. Are you seeing any positive changes in the literary world as a result?
I think we are seeing changes. I worry, though, a little bit about the way change is happening. I worry that Black folks aren't actually behind the changes and the decisions that are being made. I use the comparison of a spin bike. I think, you know, you can change the tension on a spin bike so that it's a hard climb, or you can loosen it so that it's kind of out of control. And I think before it was like we were on the highest tension, right? Black folks and activists were trying to make change, and it was just like slow creeping crawl. And it feels like now, and especially last year, people sort of turned the tension all the way off and just started frantically spinning out, giving messages, making changes, but not really thinking about the ramifications. And so for me, it's about making sure we're doing both. We're moving quickly in the right direction, but we're also being thoughtful. It is, for me, never a rush to do the right thing quickly. It's a rush to do the right thing consistently. And that's my worry about what's happening, and that people will burn out from the way they're doing things now. They won't see the results they're looking for in order to justify the spending or the speed at which they're moving. And that concerns me a little bit.
Jael, we've run out of time. These characters have really stayed with me. Congratulations on such a great book. Inquiring minds want to know, is there a part 2, a sequel?
I can say that something is definitely in the works, and I promise it will not take me 8 years to write it.
Well, big congratulations. We're so excited, and I can't wait to read the sequel.
Thank you.
And that's it for tonight's agenda in the summer. Tomorrow, an update on efforts to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic in Ontario. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Thanks for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. See you tomorrow.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.